When multiplying matrices together, you first need to identify the dimensions of the matrices that you're using. In this case, our first matrix has 2 rows and 2 columns, so that would be a 2 by 2 matrix. And the same dimensions are also given for the second matrix there. That's also a 2 by 2 matrix. Now, as you can see, the number of columns in our first matrix and the number of rows in our second matrix are equal. Therefore, we can multiply these two matrices together. If they weren't equal, then the product would not exist and we'd be able to move on to another problem. The two other remaining dimensions, the number of rows from the first matrix and the number of columns from the second matrix, determine our answer matrix dimensions. So our answer matrix will also, in this case, be a 2 by 2. Now that's not always going to be the case. They won't always have a 2 by 2 matrix multiplied by another size matrix will yield a different answer matrix. So what I like to do is I like to create my answer matrix with the same number of blanks as are necessary for this product. So it needs to have 2 rows. I'm going to draw in 2 rows for blanks and a second column as well, so that my answers will all go in those blanks, and I know that then I have manipulated my problem matrices and gotten my final answer. Now to multiply matrices, you're going to take a look at a row from the first matrix and a column from the second matrix in order to find your solutions. So for example, I'm going to look at this first row and then my first column. Since this is row 1, column 1, my answer will go in my first row, first column blank that I have created. I'm going to multiply my 5 times 5, and I'm going to add that to 6 times 1. And then in my final answer matrix, once I have simplified that, 5 times 5 is 25, and 6 times 1 is 6, so that will yield a final solution of 31. Let's find another. If I take a look at my first row and then my second column of values, I can multiply those to find this entry in my first row, second column. So 5 times 6 plus 6 times 8. 5 times 6 is 30 and 6 times 8 is 48. When I add those two together, I get a final answer of 78 for my first row, second column value. Now to move on, let's find our values in the second row. I'm going to use my second row values, 8 and -7, and I'm going to multiply them by each of the columns that I have in my second matrix. So let's first of all find our value that goes here in this first column. So 8 times 5 plus -7 times 1. 8 times 5 is 40, and -7 times 1 is -7. So when I add those two quantities together, I have a sum of 33. And then my last bit that I have to do is take my second row from this first matrix and then my second column from the second matrix and multiply those. So 8 and 6 needs to be multiplied. We'll add that product to -7 times 8. 8 times 6 is 48, and -7 times 8 is -56. When I add those together, I have a sum of -8. And this is my final answer matrix. Moving on to another example. I have a 1 by 3 matrix, and I have a 3 by 1 matrix that I want to see if I can multiply them together. In this case, the number of columns for the first and the number of rows from the second are equal, so yes, I can multiply them together, and my final answer matrix will have these dimensions. It will have 1 row, and it will have 1 column. So this is a quick one. So you're going to take your matrices, and I'm going to create my answer matrix here, and I've only got 1 row and 1 column, so I've only got the 1 blank to fill in. And I'm going to take 5 times 5 and add that to 9 times 8 and add that to 1 times 10. When I find that solution, then I have the answer. 5 times 5 is 25, 9 times 8 is 72, and 1 times 10 is 10. So when I add them all together, I have my final solution of 107. And there's my final answer matrix. It is a 1 by 1 matrix. And the last example for you. If I have a 2 by 3 matrix, and then I have a 3 by 1 matrix. Again, the number of columns in this first matrix matches the number of rows in the second, so I can multiply them together. And then in this case, my answer matrix will have 2 rows and 1 column. So I'm going to create my answer blanks. I have 2 rows, but only the 1 column, so I don't need to create any other blanks. Now let's take a look at our matrices. I'm going to take my first row and multiply that times the column of values in the second matrix. So 2 times negative 1 plus 5 times negative 2 plus 6 times negative 3. And then I'm going to take my second row of values and multiply by that same column. So 8 times negative 1 plus negative 1 times negative 2 plus negative 6 times negative 3. And once I simplify all of those quantities, using my order of operations, of course, so I multiply first and then I add all of those products together, my first row value is negative 30, and my second row value is 12.